Hello then, welcome to the nation. I'm Jessy Chahal. Today we take a look at globally what is happening in terms of politics and crisis, and of course, two things that are unfolding at the moment. What's happening in the UK and in Sri Lanka. Let's begin with what's happening in Sri Lanka. President Gotabaya Rajapaksa and the Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe have agreed to resign from their posts. That's happening today. However, the president has fled the country so far in the early hours before he was due to resign. This happening after widespread protests over his handling of a devastating economic crisis. Now, there's a major trust deficit when it comes to the president in particular, and many of the protesters and others are doubtful as to whether or not he will in fact leave his post as promised. Remember, that was meant to happen today. This comes after the economic crisis in the country has shown few signs of improvement. Are they in a crisis? Yes. Are they in turmoil? Yes. Who will be the new leader? Of course, I'd like to bring in my guests, three panelists of four the day for our discussion. We've got the right experts here, and they will have the insights into what is happening here. So all around, bring Pete, AZMI, and of course, Dr. O as well for our conversation today. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me. I know all of you've got your finger on the pulse here with what's going on. Things are unfolding and developing by the minute. Let's take a sort of a roundtable approach here and get your opinions about this country, Sri Lanka, once teeming with tourism, but right now in absolute turmoil and topsy-turvy. Dr. O, perhaps we can begin with you.
Well, I had the distinct privilege of having worked in Sri Lanka for a few weeks, a quarter of a century ago, during the height of the Civil War. And what impressed me the most was almost at every major street corners, you would have machine guns set up, and then soldiers trying to check on cars and people and so on. So that was a very difficult period in Sri Lanka's history. And as the Civil War subsided, I think around, let's say, about 12, 13 years ago, all of us would hope for the best for Sri Lanka. And we saw, indeed, as you mentioned, tourists started to flock into Sri Lanka and foreign investments as well. But I think they made perhaps several rather critical mistakes. Number one is, of course, they borrow too much money, which they could, until an extent that they could not repay their foreign debts. And a lot of this money were not properly spent, for example, on what we will call import substitution industry. Instead of having to import a lot of your essential goods, you have the local industry producing those goods. But a lot of this money was not used for this import substitution, but instead for building a lot of these very grandiose, what we would call white elephant projects and so on. And as a result, not only the country now could not repay its foreign debt, it also does not have enough foreign reserve to import a lot of essential goods. That's why people across the various communities, they are going to the streets, and they even topple the government here.
I'm just going to jump in there, Dr. O, and get Pete's view of this. Do you agree? And do you see it this way as well, that the country has borrowed too much money? But also, perhaps, what else are you reading into what's happening there, Pete?
Yeah, I do absolutely agree with that. I mean, we've been watching this unrest develop since 2019. And the pandemic sort of put it on hold, but what we're now seeing is that earlier frustration really beginning to boil over. So that the current crisis really said to have begun due to multiple compounding factors like money creation, a nationwide policy to shift to organic or biological farming, the Easter bombings of 2019, and of course the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, which affected Sri Lanka's tourist trade, one of its biggest foreign earners. Many, as has been said, also blame economic mismanagement, as the government really racked up huge debts, particularly with countries like China, to fund what critics have called unnecessary infrastructure projects. And there's also been question marks about who's leading the country and what can be done to restore order.
Absolutely. I mean, the government has fallen, the economy has collapsed. AZMI, what now for Sri Lanka?
Jesse, as Pete said just now, who's leading the country? We have no idea. And the Prime Minister just declared emergency, maybe to bring some sanity and stability. The first thing they need to do is to elect a new president, to form a new government, so that they can proceed forward. But again, I just cannot help comparing when the Sri Lankans going over to the presidential palace. I just cannot help to compare with the January 6th riot when the Americans stormed the state capitol building.
Yeah.
Comparing the two, I think the Sri Lankans are very, very, I would say, disciplined. They do not act, I would say, barbaric when they stormed the presidential palace as compared to the riots in state capitol building. That's what I'm seeing, what's happening in Sri Lanka, Jesse.
Mm-hmm. Well, the president has fled to the Maldives. This unfolded a couple of hours ago. We're looking at how now, in terms of restoration, what can happen. They have a system where they have a unitary state and a democratic republic, which is governed by a semi-presidential system. This is a mixture of presidential system and a parliamentary system. Dr. O, how does this system work?
Well, Sri Lanka essentially has a so-called presidential system of government, with the elected president enjoying I would say, the bulk of the executive power. Yes, there's a prime minister, but he is very much subservient to the view of the president. But that was not always the case. I remember in the I was not born yet, but in the 50s and 60s and so on, Sri Lanka had a system whereby the prime minister was the one which has the most executive power, with famous prime ministers such as the first women prime minister, Mrs. Sri Mawar Bandaranaike, and so on. And you just saw her daughter who became the country's president. And I think over time, as the civil war erupted in the 1970s and 80s, the president became more powerful figure. And there was at least one Sri Lankan president who was assassinated, I think, in the early 1990s by the guerrillas. So I think by now, perhaps the only saving grace out of this is the fact that Sri Lankans across different communities, they sort of unite together to try to bring together a change to Sri Lanka. Yeah.
That's right. I think that's a good point as well. I wanted to bring this to your attention, Pete and AZMI. Please jump in at any time. We are seeing activists really band together, not just of certain party or certain movements, but the entire nation. What is this saying about the uprising of Sri Lanka and what they want for their future? Pete?
I think that it follows examples of what we've seen happening previously around the world, where there is a situation where the public have reached their limit in terms of the pain that they're suffering because of economic policy, cost of living crisis, and social issues that they deem to be unfair. I mean, on paper in Sri Lanka, as an example here, there are very clear definitions of lines of responsibility between the president and the parliament. However, these are fairly clouded in the actual delivery of government, including who actually appoints who into what positions, remembering that the president's family dynasty has ruled Sri Lanka for decades and nepotism is rife. So what we're seeing social movements that have basically said enough. This is not what we want. This is not the government we want. This is not the system that we want. That everything is dysfunctional and that we need to have it changed. And if you're not going to change it, then we the people will change it.
That's right. AZMI, we know the president promised, in fact, that he will resign and he will make a clear path, a way for a peaceful transition of power to happen. Here's a man who had, if I'm not mistaken, four other family members in the government as well. It was him against, the ruling system of the country, the parliament. How did this carry on for so long? I.e., how did he lead this country into this disaster?
Yeah, there's a problem with when the president having too much power on his hand, not only on mismanagement on the economic matters, but during Rajapaksa being the president is very brutal during the civil war with the Tamil Tigers. But again, as Pete said just now, it's the people's power. But the more important thing right now is that uh, as by the minute, I think Rajapaksa has still not resigned because by being the president, when he's in Sri Lanka, he has the immunity. I think that's a very powerful power that's given as a president. But again, the country need to move forward. They need to elect the president as soon as possible to form a unity government so that aids, so that bailout from World Bank, from IMF can be given to the next government. I think the most important thing, even though the people's power has shown its influence, the effectiveness, but after this, what's next? So they need a very stable government.
That's right. We also know that the Sri Lankan Prime Minister has declared a state of emergency in his role as the acting president at this point. And of course, the president himself, Rajapaksa, has fled to the Maldives, leading to more protests amid an economic crisis, now a national crisis there as well. Germany probably agree with me that yes, Maldives is perhaps a good location to be at right now with its pristine beaches and whatnot. But from that, let's switch our direction to what's happening in the UK. Another political crisis there. We've heard the announcement that British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has resigned, but questions are being asked about whether he has and what the current situation is like there. Actually, Pete, perhaps you want to take the lead on this.
Sure. After 59 resignations and a cabinet revolt, the Prime Minister finally agreed to leave, bringing the end to one of probably the most divisive and turbulent periods in British political history. And as you said, his announcement sparked a debate about when and if he will actually leave. And the question many are asking now is he lying about resigning or not? Because there was no apology in his statement, no contrition, no use of the word resign, and no one has yet seen the resignation letter. And importantly, if Mr. Johnson hasn't been to the Queen to submit his resignation, then he hasn't actually resigned. So the question is this resigning or stalling? And the other question that's coming up out of this whole thing is that whilst he is remaining in a so-called caretaker role, many are asking that if he's not fit to be the Prime Minister, as the internal rebellion amongst his MPs clearly indicated, then surely he's not fit to be a caretaker Prime Minister. So the situation really is not clarified or resolved, and he's left the UK really in a state of paralysis, confusion, and massive infighting now within his own political party.
That's right. UK media has called Boris Johnson the Prime Minister who broke all the rules. Once again, Azmi, how are you reading into this, and what do you see happening now in the near term?
Yeah, I think as I just want to pick up on what Pete said just now. Boris Johnson, yeah, it's true that he's not fit to be the caretaker prime minister, but the problem is that only the Labour Party that are throwing out the idea Boris Johnson should not be the caretaker prime minister. I think the Conservatives are still at a haywire. From 11 hopefuls, they trickle down to 8. I think
Right.
8 hopefuls, even though for the first round of, I would say, the rotation for the first round of this particular election, I guess, 8 demonstrate that how fractured is the Conservative Party. I think it's too much. From 11 to 8 is too much, I guess. Maybe after this, maybe today, I think by the end of today, from 8 should go down drastically for either 4 or 3 hopeful. I think the Conservative are very fractured right now. I think that's the reason why Boris Johnson is still the caretaker prime minister, Jessy.
Well,
Hey,
I think
there's also a very key point as well, as Asmi quite rightly says, Jesse, is that all of those who are standing for the leadership position, most of them were in fact in cabinet together with Mr. Johnson and responsible for implementing the policies which are so hated in the UK. So the question really is, how can any new Prime Minister have credibility based on a manifesto that has already thrown Boris Johnson out of power?
but Boris Johnson himself, I mean, he's caught up in a web of messy legacy of lies. There's Brexit that he has on his sort of record as well, and following other scandals. But rightly pointed out, Pete, Doctor, are you reading into this similarly, or do you have a different point of view?
Well, I have a slightly different point of view. Number one, I think it's rather odd nowadays. A lot of these leaders who became unpopular, they will say, I'm stepping down or resign and so on, but typically it's undated, right? So they don't give a precise date, simply saying, well, I think I would step down and so on. But I think overall, if you look at, for example, Brexit and so on, Johnson, under his administration, ushered in a rather smooth transition for Brexit as compared to, for example, his predecessor, Theresa May, with very convoluted agreeing or disagreeing over whether to leave and so on. Number two, if you look at his handling of the pandemic, there was initial chaos, but afterwards, this sort of shutting down or opening up the economy according to various indicators and so on, that way of handling the economy has been adopted by many other countries as well. And if you compare the amount of money the British government spent on subsidizing the incomes of various employees, I think it's proportion-wise is much higher than, let's say, in Malaysia. So I think it's more like all his what they would call peccadillos, all his small mistakes, all these scandals over parties held in Downing Street and so on. Eventually have accumulated so much that they are taken advantage of by some of his more ambitious colleagues. You see how ambitious they were. They resigned, and the next day they would declare their candidacies to be the leaders. So he fell prey to this sort of what I would call accumulations of various scandals rather than people's dislike of his policies.
All right, but it seems like right now no one really has the answer. We are going to see a new leader emerge. Will we see new leadership? That is left to be seen. But are we likely to see any significant change in current strategy or outlook under a new prime minister that will work both domestically and internationally, Asmi?
Yeah, the current front runner is the former chancellor or the former finance minister, Rishi Sunak. But again, during his campaign, he said that there are no new strategies, there are no new policies put out by him. But again, integrity is the most important thing. And I think the starting downfall of Boris Johnson is because of his integrity. But Jesse, I have to confess, I'm quite frustrated when Javid, the former Minister of Health, dropped down before the first round of voting because he started the downfall of Boris Johnson. As a cabinet minister, senior cabinet minister, resigning, he started the downfall. But again, he don't have enough votes from the 20 MPs. So I think there'll be not much different in terms of foreign policy, whoever be taking over from Boris Johnson, Jesse.
That's right. Boris Johnson has said he will step down. The big question is when and where does that leave the country in a bit of a limbo at this point of time, Pete? With the new prime minister in place, will this reduce the current state of government and provide a significant level of stability as the UK now battles with a number of crises? Of course, we're still, battling the COVID crisis.
Jessy, I think that the UK political scene appears to be deeply fractured, both Labour, the opposition, and within the ruling government. And there are significant stresses in the social structure as well that's been brought on by the policies that Johnson implemented, and which now appear to be part of the leadership contenders' own sort of soundbite manifestos. Mr. Johnson wasn't the key to the problem on his own. The problem is actually in all of the dysfunctional apparatus, the power structures, the broken institutions that elevated him and protected him for years. And of course, exposing these and creating the public demand to dismantle or reorganise such that have in fact been in place for generations. So the actual problem many in the UK see is that the next UK Prime Minister will actually be elected by 0.2% of the UK's population, by an internal party vote rather than a vote from the electorate. And that raises the issue of his or her mandate, which most likely will be resolved by a general election, which is the vast majority of pollsters predict that the Conservatives will lose and lose heavily. So the problem may be for a new Prime Minister with no mandate who doesn't go to the polls, or a further vote of no confidence that will force the new PM's hand. The reality really seems to be that a leadership change in a party that is now quite deeply disliked and distrusted in the UK public isn't going to make any meaningful change to the structure. And it looks like the social fractures that we see in the British society right now are beyond fixing with the continuing sort of Conservative government. There has to be a change in government to resolve those issues.
Right. Now, we know that, through all of this as well, UK has lost global influence. It showing decline in national strength, of course, internally, all of this unfolding in terms of politics as well, Dr. O. What now for UK? How does it salvage itself, even with a new leader in place?
Well, I don't think the United Kingdom has sort of lost a lot of prestige around the world. It remains a steadfast ally of the United States, very proactively taking part in most of those initiatives of the West against Russia and being tough on China and so on. What the UK would perhaps need to focus a little bit more is to perhaps conclude more of these free trade agreements with the major economies of the world, because after Brexit, of course, it could not avail itself of some of those European facilities which previously, for example, would have facilitated free trade and so on. It now has to conclude free trade agreements, for example, with the United States, with many other Commonwealth countries, including even Malaysia. If I were the new Prime Minister, I will focus most of my efforts on this so that it benefits the socio-economic development of the United Kingdom. Yeah.
AZMI, some closing statements from you, please. We've only got about a minute left on the clock.
Yeah, just to pick up when you said UK diminishing power, I guess maybe among the Commonwealth nations, they are diminishing because most of the Commonwealth nation trying to be separated from the UK, the Queen as their head of leader. I think in that term, yes, UK. But again, to pick up on what Pete said, the next Prime Minister, the mandate is not from the people. It's from the 300 plus Conservative MPs. But again, there's a problem when you have a super majority. You can do whatever you want, I guess. Jessy?
That's right. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time, Dr. O, Peter NICOLL, and AZMI HASSAN. It's been a great conversation. Of course, we're looking at global politics, the turmoil that's happening in Sri Lanka and the UK. Us here at Bernama and the Nation will bring you the latest updates as the story develops as well. Make sure you stay tuned. We'll speak to you again. Take care then. Bye-bye.